Snow clung to the roofs of the small stone workhouse on the edge of Lancaster as dawn broke, the kind of cold Pennsylvania morning that muted every sound. The town was still half asleep when the riders appeared, men wrapped in hunting shirts, rifles across their saddles, faces hard from days of travel. Their horses steamed in the winter air as they stopped at the gate where a group of Susquehannock families had been living under government protection. Inside the building, children were just beginning to stir. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth. No one inside knew that a mob had come for them. A guard shouted for the men to state their business, but the group didn't slow. They pushed through the entrance, storming the narrow hallways with the confidence of people who believed what they were doing was justified. Some locals who saw the riders recognized the symbols on their hunting frocks, marks used by the Paxton Boys, a vigilante group from the frontier who blamed the colony's indigenous people for raids and losses during the French and Indian War, even when there was no evidence linking them to violence. Fear and anger had been building for years, worsened by stories spreading through small settlements along the Susquehanna River. Now that anger had arrived in Lancaster. Inside the workhouse, the Susquehannock families, 20 individuals in all, looked up as the men burst through the doors. They were mostly elders, women, and children. The adult men of the community had long been dead or missing after decades of conflict. These survivors had been living peacefully, relying on the provincial government's promise of protection after their village had already been threatened by the same group of riders weeks earlier. Many still clung to the belief that Lancaster authorities would keep them safe. When the mob poured in, that belief collapsed instantly. The Paxton Boys moved room to room with ruthless intent. Some of the people tried to hide behind furniture. Others held their children close, pleading in languages the attackers didn't bother to understand. The sounds of gunfire echoed off the stone walls, followed by the thud of tomahawks. When it was over, bodies lay across the floor, the fire still burning quietly beside them. Not one person inside survived. The attackers left as quickly as they'd arrived, disappearing back through the countryside while townspeople stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to interfere or stay out of the group's path. News of the killings reached the provincial government quickly, and officials in Philadelphia were horrified. The remaining members of the Susquehannock, 14 people who had been away from the workhouse that morning, were moved under armed guard to the Lancaster jail for their own protection. They were told it was the safest place they could be. But the promise meant nothing. Once word reached the Paxton Boys that survivors still lived. Less than 2 weeks later, on December 27, 1763, the riders returned. Snow again blanketed the roads as more than 50 armed men traveled through the countryside, refusing to be stopped by messengers or warnings. By the time they reached Lancaster, the sun was already low. The jail warden, who believed the group intended to free prisoners, didn't realize the mob had come for the Susquehannock until it was too late. The Paxton Boys forced their way inside, breaking through the doors with rifle stocks and axes. The survivors, men, women, and children, had no chance to escape. Some clung to each other in the narrow cells. Others stood back in fear as the attackers stormed the corridor. The jail's thick stone walls trapped every sound as the mob opened fire and swung their weapons. The violence lasted only minutes. When the riders left, all 14 Susquehannock lay dead on the jail floor. The bodies were later gathered for burial, but the sense of shock that swept through the colony was impossible to bury. Pennsylvania had lived with tension between settlers and indigenous communities for decades, but this was different. These were people the government had sworn to protect. They were unarmed, under guard, and murdered inside a provincial institution. It forced even hardened frontiersmen to confront the lawlessness spreading across the backcountry. The colony's governor issued warrants for the arrest of the Paxton Boys, but almost no one on the frontier would reveal their identities. Many settlers saw them as heroes standing up against a government they believed cared more about maintaining peace with native groups than protecting its own citizens. Pamphlets defending the Paxton Boys began circulating, arguing that the attacks were necessary, even righteous. Others fiercely condemned them, warning that vigilante justice threatened the stability of the entire colony. Benjamin Franklin became one of the most vocal critics, writing about the killings and questioning how a civilized society could condone slaughtering unarmed families. He argued that allowing such actions to go unpunished would erode the rule of law. But even his influence wasn't enough to push the government into a full-scale pursuit of the attackers. The Paxton Boys didn't hide forever. Early the next year, several hundred of them marched toward Philadelphia, demanding protection from prosecution and insisting that the government's policies had forced them to take matters into their own hands. City residents panicked at the news of their approach. Troops were called in, and leaders from both sides attempted to negotiate. Franklin himself walked out to meet the mob. Through tense conversation, he convinced them to present their grievances peacefully and disperse before violence broke out. They agreed, and the confrontation ended. But none of the killers were ever brought to trial. The Susquehannock, once a powerful nation along the Susquehanna River, were effectively wiped out after the massacre. Their final descendants were absorbed into other tribes or vanished into colonial records without further mention. The government's failure to protect them or punish their killers cast a long shadow over Pennsylvania, deepening mistrust between indigenous communities and colonial authorities. In the years that followed, settlers continued to move westward across the frontier, often unaware that entire nations had lived and been destroyed on the same land. The story of the Conestoga Massacre faded slowly, buried beneath new conflicts and expanding borders. But in Lancaster, the jail where the last of the Susquehannock were killed still stood, its stone walls holding the memory of a day when the promise of protection meant nothing against a mob's determination. If you walk near the site today, the noise of traffic replaces the sound of hooves and gunshots, but the weight of what happened there remains. The massacre didn't just mark the end of a people. It revealed how fear and suspicion on the frontier could overwhelm justice, how quickly a community could be erased when hatred was allowed to go unanswered. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.